The ground didn't just shake, it roared. At exactly 7:17 a.m. on the morning of September 19, 1985, the people of Mexico City were starting their day. Some were heading to work. Some were preparing their children for school. Others were still asleep. The capital, a sprawling metropolis built on the bed of an ancient lake, buzzed with life as it always had. And then, without warning, the earth convulsed beneath them. At first, it was a rumble, a low, groaning vibration. People paused, looked around, birds scattered, dogs barked, car alarms went off. Then came the real shaking. The ground pitched and bucked like the deck of a ship in a storm. Skyscrapers began to sway, groaning like dying animals. Windows exploded, walls cracked, ceilings split. Entire buildings folded in on themselves as if made of paper. Within minutes, the city was plunged into chaos. The earthquake registered an astonishing 8.1 on the Richter scale. Its epicenter lay off the Pacific coast near Michoacán, hundreds of kilometers away, but Mexico City bore the brunt of it. Because this city, for all its size and beauty, was built on unstable soil, ancient sediment from a dried-up lake bed. It magnified the tremors, amplified the damage, and the cost in human life was catastrophic. Hospitals crumbled with patients still in their beds. Schools collapsed with children inside. Apartment towers turned to dust, trapping hundreds, sometimes entire families, under layers of rebar and concrete. Electricity went out. Water lines burst. Gas lines ignited. It was hell on earth. But the true horror, the deeper, more insidious tragedy, wasn't just the quake. It was what the quake revealed. Because this wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a man-made catastrophe, years in the making. The epicenter may have been in the Pacific, but the corruption that doomed Mexico City, that lived right beneath its feet. In the hours after the quake, as emergency crews scrambled to reach survivors, it became clear that certain buildings had been especially vulnerable. Some fell like dominoes, others, right next door, stood firm. Why? That question haunted the rescue workers, and when survivors were pulled from the wreckage, dazed and covered in dust, they began to talk. About creaking walls, about suspicious cracks that had appeared weeks earlier, about renovations that had cut corners. Engineers and journalists began to dig, and what they found was devastating. The construction boom of the 1960s and 70s had brought new life to the city, but it had also brought corruption. Mexico, like many developing nations at the time, was racing to modernize. Skyscrapers, hospitals, apartment blocks, entire neighborhoods had gone up seemingly overnight. But building codes, enforcement, oversight, often non-existent. Developers paid bribes to inspectors. Concrete was diluted to save money. Rebar was skipped entirely in some structures. Paperwork was falsified. Unsafe renovations went unreported. The city had grown, but it had grown hollow. One of the most tragic examples was the collapse of the Juarez Hospital. The facility was meant to be a state-of-the-art medical center. Instead, it became a tomb. Over 500 people, patients, nurses, doctors, were killed when the building pancaked into itself. Survivors later revealed that cracks had been appearing for months. Complaints had been made. Nothing was done. Another tragedy struck the Televisa studios, a major television network. The building collapsed live on air, cameramen, anchors, stagehands, all buried. Rescue workers dug through the debris for days, pulling out bodies and, miraculously, survivors. Then there was the Conalep Vocational School. Nearly 300 students died there. Classrooms built with substandard materials collapsed like sandcastles. In total, at least 412 buildings completely collapsed. Another 3,000 were severely damaged. The historic city center, once filled with colonial-era buildings, was devastated. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble. And yet, in the absence of a coordinated government response, something remarkable happened. The people rose. Ordinary citizens, men, women, even children, formed rescue brigades. They dug with bare hands. They carried water to survivors. They organized triage centers in parks and plazas. Volunteers from around the country arrived to help. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't ask for permission. They acted. And in doing so, they saved thousands. One of the most iconic images from the aftermath wasn't of destruction, but of unity. A group of volunteers, fists raised in the air, signaling for silence so they could hear trapped voices beneath the rubble. They became known as the Topos, the Moles. And they would go on to become a legendary volunteer search and rescue team, traveling the world to help others in future disasters. But the government? The silence from the top was deafening. President Miguel de la Madrid didn't appear in public until nearly 36 hours after the quake. His administration downplayed the death toll, initially claiming only a few hundred had died. The real number? Likely between 10,000 and 30,000. Why the cover-up? Partly pride, partly politics. Mexico was set to host the 1986 World Cup. International confidence had to be maintained. But mostly, it was fear. Fear of what the quake had exposed. Because building after building that collapsed had one thing in common. They had been approved by government inspectors. Their permits had been signed, their safety assured. But they weren't safe. Not even close. The quake didn't just tear open the ground. It tore open the rot at the heart of Mexico's institutions, and people were furious. Protests erupted. Survivors demanded accountability. Journalists published exposés. Engineers gave damning interviews. The people had witnessed firsthand the cost of corruption, and they would not forget. The 1985 earthquake became a political turning point. Civil society, long suppressed under Mexico's one-party system, began to stir. New organizations were formed, advocacy groups, anti-corruption watchdogs, community unions. Out of the rubble, a new Mexico began to rise. But the scars remained. For weeks after the quake, the smell of death lingered in the air. Thousands of bodies were never recovered. Mass graves were dug. Families waited outside collapsed buildings, praying for news that never came. And some were never even counted. Entire neighborhoods in poorer districts were destroyed, yet official records failed to account for many of the victims there. It was as if their lives had never existed, but they had, and their deaths spoke volumes. They spoke of the cost of greed, of what happens when safety is sold to the highest bidder, of what happens when shortcuts are taken and corners cut, and the people in charge look the other way. The 1985 Mexico City earthquake was a natural disaster, but its deadliest consequences were man-made, and it left a warning behind, carved into the very bones of the city. It's not just the tremors that kill, it's the lies that let them. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.